Are you experiencing new dynamics and tensions arising with the members of your household because of this shelter in place? Well, let me tell you, you're not alone. I think part of what's going on is that for many folks, vital needs are coming up for us during this adjustment to COVID-19. Needs that relate to our physical health, our emotional health, our values, and our life goals. And in the context of sheltering in place, we may need to talk with the members of our household more about our needs and boundaries, but these are hard conversations that we're typically not taught how to navigate. So since talking about needs and boundaries is a huge part of my job, I wanted to share some tips. And in this video, I'm going to talk about identifying your essential needs and boundaries, a proactive exercise to support the health of your household, communicating about boundary violations, and what to do about conflicting boundaries. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, what I mean by a boundary is a limit that we determine for ourselves that helps protect our emotional safety, our physical safety, our values, and our life goals. Both knowing and communicating about our boundaries are tools that we have to keep our relationships healthy, and that includes the relationship we have with the members of our household. So let's start with the steps to identifying what our boundaries even are. And that starts with noticing when our internal alarm clock goes off that tells us, hey, something's not right or I'm not okay. And all of our internal alarm clocks look differently, but what I encourage people to think about is, how do you feel after an earthquake or right after you've been in a car accident? Some people feel numb or frozen or doubt that it happened. Maybe they feel sad or cry. Maybe they feel anger or fear. These sorts of reactions tend to be what our internal alarm clock does when something's not okay. All right, so once we've noticed that our internal alarm clock has gone off, the second step is to determine what needs protection, what's being threatened. And in the context of a boundary violation, we're specifically talking about a threat to our physical or emotional safety, values, or life goals. And if we can't connect the dots between our internal alarm clock going off and one of those four things being threatened, then it's actually not a boundary violation. It's possible that something's wrong. It's possible that you're feeling annoyed or frustrated, but that's different than a boundary violation, which specifically compromises one of those four things. Okay, so the last step in determining our boundary is to figure out a boundary statement, which often sounds something like, I don't want to live with someone who, fill in the blank here. So these boundary statements are strongly worded, but they're not necessarily intended to be used in a conversation or immediately acted upon. Not all boundary violations result in ending a relationship. However, forming boundary statements helps us gain internal clarity about what behaviors threaten our essential needs. And increased self-awareness is important for improving our relationship health, and identifying boundary violations helps us determine when we need to protect ourselves or communicate more clearly about our needs. So I want to give you an example, and although this is not an example from my life, I know it's real for somebody. During shelter in place, I've been homeschooling my two children. My spouse said to me, it was so nice after work, I really got to catch up with Dan on video chat. I had been with the kids all day and was desperate to talk with my friends or have some kind of a break. I felt my internal alarm clock go off. I realized that I was feeling resentful and exhausted. So I asked myself, what is the need here? And I realized that my emotional health was suffering due to having very limited time to myself. I also value sharing parental responsibilities equitably. I realized that the issue was not that my spouse spoke to a friend one time, but that the current pattern of sharing responsibilities was violating my boundaries. I realized that I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't share responsibilities equitably. And I don't want to be in a relationship where my need for alone time isn't respected. So we've talked a bit about identifying what our boundaries are, and now I want to turn to talk more deeply about how we communicate them. I've been really interested in brainstorming what a proactive approach to boundary sharing might look like, and I have an offer for you. So you can form a house meeting and do a series of go-rounds that are intended to help household members understand where each person is at and what they need. So here's what I imagine. Your first go-round would be something that you're grateful for. In the second go around, everyone would share 2 things that they're worried about. Then you would do a third go around sharing 2 actions that your household could take to support you during the shelter in place. And then I would offer that your fourth go around be another gratitude share, because in these times you can never have too much gratitude. I would also name in this house meeting that more complex conversations about our boundaries are likely going to happen in the coming weeks. And I would encourage everyone to agree to treat each other and ourselves with a lot of compassion, as much generosity and understanding as we can manifest, knowing that everyone is trying their best to survive a crisis the best way, as best they know how. And even though we're all doing our best, it does seem possible that boundary violations are going to come up. So I want to talk for a second about how to navigate boundary violation conversations when it's not proactive, when we're actually responding to a boundary crossing. So the first tip I have here is to notice your emotional state. It is really beneficial to enter into boundary violation conversations when you're calm and in control of your tone. The second tip I have is to think ahead of time about what it is that you want to say. Be clear about what the boundary violation was and how it relates to your physical or emotional health or your values or your life goals. Being able to really clearly connect those dots is really helpful in explaining for people why something has crossed a boundary. I also encourage you to think ahead of time about whether there's anything you're willing to compromise about with this boundary violation. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but I think it's helpful to come into the conversation clear about where you stand in terms of compromise. If you're in a situation where you have to respond to a boundary violation in the moment and you don't have time to calm down and you don't have time to think about what it is that you want to say, I really encourage you to be as thoughtful as possible instead of reactive. We tend to not be super clear when we're reactive. We tend to not say exactly what we mean, and it's very likely that in a reactive place, we would do a lot of blaming as opposed to explaining. And I think with a boundary violation, it's super important to explain how something has impacted us as opposed to telling someone else that their behavior is wrong in some way. Another tip I have for communicating about a boundary is to consider the following structure: I feel, because, and so I would like. Here's an example for how to fill that in. I feel overwhelmed and anxious because we are all doing different things on different devices with our sound on, which makes it really loud in here. And so I would like for folks to use their headphones whenever possible. I also recommend including some sort of acknowledgement of the other person's needs when communicating your boundary. So in this example, it might look like, I understand that you need to participate in your Zoom meetings fully and are sometimes not able to do that with your headphones in. Acknowledging the other person's needs can help a boundary be received for a few reasons. The first is it's a way to reflect to the other person that you're thinking about and care about their needs as well as your own. And secondly, it's a way to communicate that you're not setting a rule and you're not trying to control other people's behavior. Rather, you want your household to know about a need that you have so they can take it into account. So finally, my last tip in communicating a boundary is to actively listen as the person responds to your boundary. Make sure you say what you need to say, explain your need, explain your boundary, and then it's important to listen to the other person's response without interrupting. Sometimes people tell you new information when reacting to a boundary. Maybe they let you know that they didn't know about your boundary in the first place, which is great information to have. Maybe there's context that they need to tell you about their behavior. Maybe they're going to share a boundary back with you. Maybe they have a boundary that's related. And it's super important that we listen to that feedback. It's a way to keep our relationships healthy and make people feel heard. And I think there's a misconception that boundary conversations are one-sided, that one person comes with a boundary and the other person accepts it. But actually, just because I have anxiety about something, just because my internal alarm clock is going off or I'm feeling a need arise, that actually doesn't mean that the other person has to do something differently or has to change. What it means is that it's a time for us to come together and talk, to explain our needs and boundaries, notice where they're similar, where they're different, and just get on the same page. Using my example from earlier, where a boundary was violated due to sharing parental responsibilities and having access to personal time, it would be important to have a conversation. And if this was my partner or spouse, I might say something like this: "Hey, I've been feeling exhausted and I need some support. Is now an okay time to talk to you about something? I'm not feeling emotionally healthy right now, and I know having more time to myself would really help me. I'm feeling worn down from homeschooling the kids. And I wanted to ask if moving forward, you would be willing to be on parent duty on Tuesdays and Thursdays from right after when you finish work until bedtime. My plan is that I would make sure we have leftovers so I can grab a few hours of extra time to myself. I would also like to ask for your help on Saturdays, planning ideas for homeschooling in the coming weeks. I can show you the schedules that I've been making. I also know that you have been stressed and holding a lot during this time. I so appreciate that you have been doing the early morning parenting shifts every morning. This Tuesday, Thursday, and lesson planning help on Saturdays could make a big difference for me so that I'm able to stay more grounded." And that leads me to talk about one of the most challenging things about boundaries, which is when boundaries conflict. And I think the best way to talk about this is to consider an example. So let's say that one housemate is worried about their physical safety in being exposed to COVID-19 and needs the people they live with to shelter in place. And perhaps another household member has a parent outside of the house who needs support. And it's a strong value of theirs to support their family, and therefore they're not respecting the shelter in place. This is a really hard situation to be in, and I think the first step is for these two household members to come together and have a conversation about the conflict. Get clear about each other's needs and how they conflict. Even though everything is probably not going to be solved in a single conversation, it's important to start the conversation and start talking about the conflict. By trying to understand each other's needs, we build compassion for each other, which is not only crucial for trying to figure out conflicting boundaries, but for keeping our relationships healthy overall. And so I'm going to offer a couple of examples of ways that these two household members might compromise over this example of a conflicting boundary, but I want to just name that context matters a lot. What our lives look like, what our household members' lives look like is going to determine what our options are, where are our opportunities for compromise. So the solutions that I'm going to offer will not necessarily work for everyone in this situation, but here's a couple of things that might work. So maybe it would be an option to explore for the person who needs to support their parent to actually shelter in place with the parent. That's one option. If that's not feasible, maybe these household members could talk about some precautions that the person taking care of their parent could take in order to minimize their exposure to COVID-19. For example, can they commit to social distancing with everyone they come across, including their parent? Can they wear a mask? Can they make sure they're washing their hands frequently, like perhaps when they leave the house, when they leave their parents' house, when they come back into the house, lots of hand washing? The idea here is to find ways that I can partially address your needs and you can partially address my needs. Boundary conflicts require so much creativity to solve, and just to say it again, they're often not solved in a single conversation. It's about committing to coming back to the conversation, to keep in it together, to keep building compassion, and to be as creative as we can. I just think that, and especially in this moment of sheltering in place with COVID-19, as we're navigating conflicting boundaries, I really hope that people can keep in the forefront of their mind that we are in this strange and prolonged crisis, and that everyone has different crisis responses, and we're all doing our best to survive. And to just remember that when we come into these situations with our household members where we have conflicting boundaries, we're all trying our best. Whew, that was a lot, and I hope that my tips have been helpful. I want to close this video by acknowledging that some people cannot set boundaries with those in their household because somebody in their household is controlling, intimidating, and threatening. It might not be safe to have these boundary conversations. If you're experiencing abuse from an intimate partner or spouse, we hope that you'll call Shalom Bayit's helpline. We're here for you. We will also include some additional resources for households with abusive or unhealthy dynamics in the description of this video. I wish you all the best with your shelter in place and boundary conversations.